Our first speaker is Robert Jackson, who is a Michelle and Kevin Douglas Profostio Professor and Senior Fellow at the Woods Institute for the Environment and at the Precourt Institute for Energy at Stanford University. Rob?
Thank you for being here. As Dave mentioned, my name is Rob Jackson, and I chair the Earth System Science Department at Stanford, and moved here about 3 years ago. And before this, I worked for 16 or 17 years at Duke University. And while I was at Duke, with my colleague Abner Vengosh, we published the first studies looking at fracking and drinking water quality. And we began those studies in the Marcellus, went on to work in the Barnett Shale, the Fayetteville in Arkansas, and now, of course, I'm here in California. So, Dave asked us each just to introduce ourselves briefly, to tell you a bit about our perspective and our sort of expertise and experience. So, I just have a couple of photos, not PowerPoint with words that you have to read, but here's a picture that I took in a helicopter. So you're not here in California, obviously, considering how green it is, but this is the Marcellus in Pennsylvania. Right? And this is a particularly intense pad. There's storage going on here, but this is also a pad there you see with Christmas trees. So you see that activity, and then of course you can't help but see the house in back. Right? And imagine how your perspective on that activity might change depending on whether you own the mineral rights to the activity that's going out, say, on your door, or whether those mineral rights were severed decades ago and they're owned by someone else. Or whether that well pad is on your neighbor's property, but put up close to the fence line and far away from his or her house. So to think about those issues of perspectives, I think this is some of the reason why hydraulic fracturing is can be so controversial, is because of situations like this. That many people have benefited economically from this activity. Other people have been harmed in terms of their quality of life. The focus of the panel tonight is hydraulic fracturing and water quality, and I'll cut right to the chase for me. Can hydraulic fracturing be done safely? The answer to that question is yes, and I believe it is done safely most of the time. And once in a while, the exceptions, the minority, it isn't. And we can talk about what those reasons are, what the exceptions are, people being in a hurry, best practices that aren't followed by some companies, but in general, it can be. Let me just flip through a couple of pictures. So we'll just talk about really two or three things tonight. One, we'll talk about the process of hydraulic fracturing itself, the chemicals that are on the well pad, the water that's required, and that activity, like in the picture you saw before. So in this case, one thing people are most fearful of or concerned about is the hydraulic fracturing step itself. And what I want to argue tonight is that what we should most focus on is what's happening at the surface and the well integrity that protects the gas and the chemicals and the liquids for that top sort of 500 to 1,000 feet, rather than focusing on what's deep underground. Now, California is a little different than the Marcellus and the Barnett, because here in California, our hydraulic fracturing isn't a mile underground. On average, it's only 2,000 feet underground, and we creep up almost to 1,000 feet. So another area of concern, the closer you get to the surface, the less room for error you have if something goes wrong in the infrastructure that you have to protect the drinking water that people use. And then, of course, the other thing that I think people don't think about enough compared to the frack itself is what we do with the wastewater. And we generate 1 trillion gallons of wastewater a year in this country that we have to dispose of. We generate far more wastewater than we do oil and gas. And in a place like the Marcellus, that wastewater might be 10 times the salinity of seawater. Wastewater can have metals in it, it can have arsenic, it can have naturally occurring radioactivity. And of course it can have chemicals and other things that are coming back that we put underground. So this is another step where we don't pay enough attention, I think, or perhaps the public doesn't think enough about being pathologically careful about keeping track of the water, where does it go, where is it disposed of, and the states, some states do a better job of this than others. So I think we'll talk tonight about the wastewater side. You'll hear that from other people. So I'll stop. I'm looking forward to hearing from the other panelists, hearing your questions, and maybe there are some people from the industry in the audience. There isn't anyone, as far as I know, from industry here, but we're looking forward to hearing their expertise too. So thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Our second speaker is Jonathan Bishop, who is Chief Deputy Director for the State Water Resources Control Board. Jonathan?
So as said, I'm Jonathan Bishop. I'm the Chief Deputy Director at the State Water Resource Control Board. The reason that I'm here is because of her, and you'll hear about her later, Katharine more. But a few years ago, the legislature decided that the State Water Board needed to be involved in oversight of the oil and gas activities in California, primarily related to well stimulation or fracking. And so my staff reviewed well stimulation activities, well stimulation activities, primarily looking for potential impacts to groundwater. In California, almost all of the hydraulic fracturing occurs here in the area around Bakersfield. There's a little bit that has gone on in different places around the state, but that's where almost all of it happens right now. There is a concern that they will figure out how to extract from the Monterey Shale that's along the coast, and that might be fracked in the future. But here, I can break this, I think. We'll try that. That says 77,000 wells, and that's very shocking, but those are not wells that have been stimulated. Those are all the wells, oil wells in California. So how did we get to having regulation about well stimulation? Well, many of you have probably seen Gasland or some other documentary about fracking on the East Coast. In response, Dogger, which is the Division of Oil and Gas and Geothermal Resources, they're the state agency with oversight over oil and gas production in the state. They released some draft regulations in January 2013. There was still a lot of public concern, and I can understand why. So under the state law at the time and under federal law, there was no regulation for hydraulic stimulation. It was considered just part of oil production, and there was no one keeping track. So Senate Bill 4 by Pavley set up requirements for well stimulation in California, and the part of that pertains to me was it included a requirement that all stimulated wells in California have groundwater monitoring associated with them if there's any protected water in the vicinity. And to do that, it required us to develop model criteria for groundwater monitoring associated well stimulation. And so my staff, along with USGS and Lawrence Livermore National Labs, went out and did a bunch of research into what would make sense, had a bunch of meetings with stakeholders, went all over the state, talked to people, and adopted model criteria in 2015. In essence, I'm going to skip ahead and then go back to this. In essence, what it requires is that if you assume this is a well that's being stimulated, there has to be monitoring in the deepest protected water, that water that's closest to that fracking job, and the most shallow water. And the reason for that is if you're going to have a problem, it's likely to be at the surface. That's where you have the biggest issues. I agree with Rob, that's where you tend to have the most problems. So we want that protected. But there's also concern in many areas that the stimulation is happening right below the caprock, which traps the oil and gas. And so you want to be looking to see if you're getting any signals in that first aquifer that's above the stimulation. So So that essentially, this is required for every well. Of course, it's not just one well. You have to have enough wells so that you can actually figure out what groundwater grading is and where it is. And there are usually lots of stimulated wells in one area, so you might have combine a monitoring system so that you can get a bigger area. So we have been doing that since 2015. Monitoring is required where there's protected water. And what does protected water mean? In California, what it means is that if it has less than 10,000 milligrams per liter of salts, or it is outside of an exempted area. There are areas that have been exempted as drinking water sources under the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act so that there is a place to put that produced water, that wastewater that Rob was talking about, which I tend to agree is probably the more problematic piece of the whole oil and gas production, if you put aside climate change. We are required to do, they are required to test a whole bunch of stuff that's in there. I think the areas that are of most interest are these last two. These are supposed to identify, is there a signature from the actual well stimulation in the groundwater? The rest of these things are things that are in groundwater or in petroleum products, but those two are only coming from a well stimulation, and that's the idea there. As I said, we've been doing it for a while. They have to sample before and after, and they have to put all the information onto a public website. It's our website called GeoTracker. It's where all of our groundwater data is. In addition to this monitoring that is done by the operator when they want to do a well stimulation, SB4 requires the state board to do regional monitoring to look at essentially the health of the aquifers associated with oil and gas stimulation. So we have hired the U.S. Geologic Survey to do that. And the oil industry kindly gives us money every year. They don't kindly, they're required to under law, to pay for this. And we've been doing salinity mapping to determine where is fresh water and where is saline waters in the area around the oil fields. We've been looking at what comes out of a produced well. What is in that wastewater that comes up with oil? In California, most of the time, when you pump up a gallon of oil, you get 9 gallons of water along with it. That water is salty, and it's got all sorts of other things in it because it's been sitting in contact with oil and gas for millions of years, or hundreds of thousands of years. I'm not a geologist. We've been working on 3D visualization so we can look at what's happening in the oil fields and in the groundwater associated with it, and looking at different priority and risk assessment studies. And so I'd be happy to take questions afterwards, and thank you very much.
Our next speaker is James Rosenblum, who's a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Colorado in Boulder. James?
So as Dave mentioned, I'm from the University of Colorado Boulder, so my perspective is a little different, mostly based in Colorado. Kind of my experiences working with treatment and the characterization of oil and gas wastewater in Colorado. And so what you're looking at here is an essentially just completed well pad. The water tank's here, a tanker actually picking up the water, and on the other side is you can just see an oil tanker there, and this is an 8-pad well. And so my work and kind of why I was brought here was, again, focusing on characterization, so trying to identify the organic contaminants that are in these waters, as well as how to remove them through various treatment technologies. So I imagine some of you are well aware that there's multiple shale resources throughout the lower 48 states, and I really focus here in northeast Colorado, in the Denver-Julesburg Basin, but mostly I focus in the Wattenberg field. It's the most active and oil and gas region in Colorado. There's 53,000 active wells in Colorado, roughly 50% or about 25,000 active wells in just a small region in the Wattenberg field. And this is a good visual here. It's going to start back over. This goes from 1991 to 2013. And from 1991, there was 500 wells, active wells, and to 2013, almost 15,000 wells. And this is the city of Greeley. I like to put a smiley face there sometimes. You can just see the intense activity that's occurred in this region over this 12, 13-year time period. And right where this counter is, this is actually the city of Denver. So this is very close. Here's Colorado State University at Fort Collins, and this is just expanding. There was a recent moratorium that's now ending in Boulder, which would be kind of over here. So the oil and gas activity is very intense, and it's only increasing and expanding. And just kind of highlighting my work here is really focused on characterization. So we try to look at and identify the chemicals that are being used in the fracturing fluid makeups. So in Colorado, we generally use a gel-based fluid. So you're trying to pump sand or your fluid down a mile down and a mile out, and to carry that, we use this very viscous guar gum that Jonathan just pointed out here. And then we also try to identify other constituents, surfactants, things of that nature that are being used. And the focus of this work here was really trying to identify how these chemicals change over time, try to identify what's going down the well, what's returning, and how things change over time. And I think this is a nice visual to see that in this case, they use 3,000 million gallons of clean surface water mixed with a variety of chemicals. This is pumped then down a well to elongate these fractures. This water then returns to the surface over the life of the well. And this is in Colorado, nearly 99% of it's disposed through a Class 2 deep injection well. Just kind of showing this idea of we're having a fracturing fluid going down, and then this water, those returns, and this is just showing you over time that kind of this water is changing, and we're trying to characterize and again identify the organic constituents that are changing over time. And we're really trying to relate this to treatment. So again, and this one thing I do want to note here is these waters are kind of a black box. We don't know what's being injected, and we don't know necessarily what's returning outside of, let's say, hydrocarbons, things that are being in contact with the formation. So our goal is to really identify the chemicals that are coming back. And then on the treatment side, I focus on a few, mostly on the suspended solids based technologies, coagulation, flocculation, as well as biological treatments, really trying to remove the dissolved organic compounds. But also a huge focus is also on the membrane-based treatments for salts, dissolved solids. And so that's really kind of highlights kind of the work that we do, again, identifying the compounds and then trying to remove them through various treatments. Again, in Colorado, we have relatively good quality water for produced water around the salinity of salt water, and we're trying to motivate the industry to reuse more of their wastewater, ideally for continued hydraulic fracturing. Really is kind of what we view as the low-hanging fruit for reusing this water in Colorado.
Our next speaker is Katharine Moore. Dr. Moore is with the California Senate Natural Resources and Water Committee. Katharine?
Thank you, Dave, and I'd certainly like to thank you for inviting me to participate in the panel today. So as Dave said, my name is Katharine Moore. I'm a consultant for the Senate Natural Resources and Water Committee in the state legislature in Sacramento. Because I work in the legislature, my boss actively encourages me not to do PowerPoint, so sorry about that. I would just add the sort of standard legislative staff disclaimer, which is what I'm about to say is my opinion and does not reflect the official position of the legislature or any current or former member of the legislature. The Senate Natural Resources and Water Committee has jurisdiction over oil and gas issues. I was asked to give a little background on state policy with respect to fracking. And so I'll start by talking a little bit about what existing law sort of pre-SB4. As both Rob, I believe, and Jonathan mentioned, the state oil and gas regulator is the Division of Oil, Gas, and Geothermal Resources, or DOGGR, located in the Department of Conservation and the Natural Resources Agency. The leader of DOGGR is the oil and gas supervisor. Under existing state law, the oil and gas supervisor has really extensive authority to regulate pretty much anything related to oil and gas here in the state. I should also add that the State Water Resources Control Board, as well as the regional boards under both federal and state law and regulation, also has extensive authority to protect water quality here in the state. So that's sort of the starting point. Back in 2011, the U.S. Energy Information Administration released an estimate of the total shale oil reserves in the United States. And at that time, they thought fully 3/4 of the total nation's reserves was in California, actually in the Monterey Shale. Now, it turns out the USEIA was off by at least a factor of 30, but it took them a few years to admit that. And so in 2011, there was a lot of concern that there was going to be a whole lot of fracking going on in California. The then chair of the Senate Natural Resources Committee, State Senator Fran Pavley, wrote a letter to the then Dogger supervisor and said, hey, what's going on with fracking here in California? I admit I am paraphrasing what the letter actually said. The then supervisor a few months later replied, well, might be happening. We're not really sure. We don't directly regulate it. We don't know. So as you might imagine, that piqued legislative interest, and in the 2011-2012 legislative session, there were 3 bills introduced specific to fracking. One of them was a fracking ban bill, and I will tell you that all 3 of those failed. As Jonathan alluded to, in the winter of 2012-2013, Dogger released a draft proposal for fracking regulations, which were, in my opinion, admittedly, kind of weak. And the legislature came back in 2013, raring to go, and introduced 9 bills related to fracking, 3 of which were ban bills, 6 of which were regulatory bills. And there was 1 bill standing at the end. It was SB 4, as Jonathan mentioned, authored by then State Senator Fran Pavley, who, again, as I mentioned, was the chair of our committee. Governor Brown signed that into law in September of 2013. It became law January 1st, 2014. While SB 4 has certainly been controversial, it remains, in my opinion, easily the most comprehensive and stringent statutory framework for the regulation of well stimulation treatments in the nation. You'll notice I switched to saying well stimulation treatments. That's actually a little bit broader definition than just fracking. So it includes acid fracturing as well as acid stimulation. And so that's actually what the law here is in California. It's for well stimulation treatments. In the interest of time, I won't go into everything that SB 4 does, but highlight just a few of the important things relevant to what we're talking about here tonight. The first thing that it did was require that there be an independent scientific study performed, which was completed in July of 2015. And that really highlighted, at least here in California, what we know about fracking, what we don't know about fracking, and where there's some data gaps that we really need to sort of fill in if we're going to really try and understand fracking here in the state. Additionally, SB 4 required that for any oil well operator who wanted to frack a well, they'd have to get a specific permit for that from Dogger, and Dogger working in collaboration with the Water Board and others. So it wasn't under the table anymore, it was out in the open, and that was really one of the underlying motivations for SB 4, was to provide some transparency to what was going on in the oil and gas fields with respect to fracking. Jonathan already mentioned the water monitoring and testing processes required by SB 4. I will add that part of SB 4, if you got a permit for fracking, you have to tell the neighbors, and that allowed the neighbors at oil company expense to get their groundwater, get baseline monitoring of their groundwater before the fracking occurred. In addition, SB 4 required pre and post frac chemical disclosure. It also required reporting of where you got the water that you were using for the frac job and what you did with it afterwards. We've got only 2.5 years or so of comprehensive data that's been compiled, and it's easy to digest even for dumb old legislative staff. So I can tell you that of the frac jobs that have occurred in California since SB 4 went into effect, the total volume of water used was on average between 100,000 and 200,000 gallons. There were some million-gallon frac jobs, but at least so far, that's the exception, not the rule. As Rob mentioned, the frac jobs are relatively shallow, 1,000, 2,000 feet down on vertical wells. 80% of the water used for fracking is water that's suitable for irrigation or domestic purposes. And as James and Rob also mentioned, virtually all of that water is, when it flows back, disposed of in injection wells. I will stop now, but I just want to leave one final thought is I wish for other oil and gas field processes we knew as much about them as we know about what's going on in fracking right now. Thank you.
Our last panelist and last speaker is Damon Nagami, who is Senior Attorney and Director of the Natural Resources Defense Council's Southern California Ecosystems Project. Damon?
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for having me here. This is a fantastic panel. And it's great going last because folks said most of the stuff. I don't have to repeat anything. I can just kind of react. I didn't know you were going to put me last, but thank you. It's great. I didn't have time to prepare slides anyway because I was in traffic for 2 hours and 20 minutes getting here from Santa Monica. But while I was in traffic, I heard on NPR today, on Marketplace, I don't know if any of you heard it on the way here. Let's give it up for public radio. Give to your local public radio station. They definitely put the news out there that other people don't report on. A great piece on fracking and the health impacts from contaminated water and some of the impacts that we're seeing. There was an interview with a man and his family in Pennsylvania, right in the Marcellus, which we heard about. So these are real concerns that we share as well, and that's why that's so important. Now, going into California, because I know the focus of this panel is hydraulic fracturing in California, I have to give it up, and NRDC, we have to give it up for Senate Bill 4 in California in 2013. That really has been a game changer. And we have to give all the credit to Senator Pavley, our champion in the Senate, and Katharine Moore, who did a fantastic job pushing that through, and Jonathan and his team, who have been implementing many of the changes that happened there. But I have to emphasize a little more of the background that these two have given. Before 2012, 2013, we didn't know anything about fracking in California. There was no information for the public to understand where it was happening, how much water was involved, what chemicals were involved in what quantities, and what kinds of impacts these activities were having on the environment and human health. We know a lot more now, and it's largely in part due to this law and its implementation that's now given us data that we can sift through and analyze. And again, we're still in the early stages of that, but that's sort of how you start to make change, is you have the baseline now to understand what's happening, and then we can go from there. For example, chemical disclosure is something that other jurisdictions around the country don't have. Here, we're starting to get information about the constituents. It is a black box. You have to know what is in the fracking fluids and the other fluids involved in the operations to really know what to look for when you're looking for the constituents that are in water. Our position on fracking in California has been that we support a moratorium until there can be safeguards in place. I think those efforts at the legislature haven't been successful. There's extreme opposition to methods, any sort of legislation to try and curb oil production due to industry. But I think what we've realized from the Senate Bill 4 enactment and the implementation is that in California, the problem is bigger than just fracking. And I would absolutely echo what Katharine is saying. You know, we dug into fracking and well stimulation because of what was happening on the East Coast and people seeing that their faucets are being lit on fire, like in the movie Gasland. It's not exactly like that out here. The level of hydraulic fracturing here in California is not as high as in other places back east, and it's a different process. It's shallower, there's less, you don't have the long horizontal fracks where they're doing it all along the way. But here in California, we have all kinds of other more advanced techniques that are sort of commonly known as enhanced oil recovery. There's steam flooding, water flooding, cyclic steam. There are all kinds of other methods that we still have to be concerned about, even though it's not specifically hydraulic fracturing, which is breaking up the rock and trying to extract the oil. But a few of the things I've heard, absolutely, we need more vigilance and more research on. I heard a reference to the regulations that govern the structure of the well. That's critical, making sure those are up to par. And to be honest, in California, they're not. And in no state No state has best practices or regulations that are strong enough in our view to sort of defend and protect our drinking water sources. So those need to come way, way up. And kudos to everybody who's been working on that, but that's a long slog because those regulations have been neglected for a long time. The last thing I want to leave you with is one thing that's critical here in California is the disposal of wastewater, both from fracking and these other enhanced oil recovery methods. What are you going to do with this water from this dirty industry? There's not a lot of great options. Injecting it underground, transporting it to other places. There are some places in the Central Valley where they're still disposing of fracking wastewater and other wastewater into unlined pits to just evaporate. Now, what happens when that water percolates into the ground and the toxins get into some sort of aquifer or other sort of source? That's something that I think everybody except the industry knows needs to go away and get addressed. But these are things that take work, take time and energy, and activists to get out and sort of beat on legislators and the administration to make them happen. Outlawing percolation pits, putting limits on production and fracking in places where it should be off limits, whether it's the Monterey Shale or other sensitive areas of the state. And finally, supporting local efforts for what local jurisdictions want to do. I also direct NRDC's Community Fracking Defense Project, where we support communities if they want to impose a moratorium or just increase standards at the sort of local level, whether it's city or county, will help with that. And the biggest picture here is, you probably heard about Governor Brown going to Bonn and the comments that he made there. So he wants to have a big subnational climate conference next fall, and we have been party in Sacramento to some of his greatest achievements on climate change. But the one glaring spot that sticks out is that in some folks' view, he hasn't done enough on oil production and curbing what's happening here in our state. So I think he has some work to do before then, and if we can come up with some ideas for him to push something through as he's riding off into the sunset and retiring to his farm up in Tehama County or wherever it is, hopefully we can do that. So I'm going to stop there and look forward to hearing some of your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Damon. Thank you, all the panelists. I'm going to ask all of our panelists now to please take seats respectively at the table. We'll start with you, Rob. Do the benefits of fracking to the environment and human health outweigh the possible risks? And can these risks, especially to water quality, be mitigated or averted? Rob, why don't you start us off?
That's an easy question. So for me, the first question isn't the right question unless we ask, what are we comparing it to? And if we're comparing hydraulic fracturing and its environmental impacts to mountaintop mining for the coal industry, then I think the answer to that question is yes. If we're comparing it to wind power or solar, the answer is probably no, but we do have to have a discussion about where our electricity comes from, how we deal with intermittency of electricity supply in the state, what we do in winter when the sun is relatively dark and the wind is relatively slow. So I guess I would only answer that question when we're talking about a specific comparison. So we can look at the water requirements for coal and nuclear and other fuels. We can look at wastewater production. We can look at the air quality effects at the power plant scale and things like that. So all of that needs to be taken into account, in my view, when we're evaluating these different options. So I think they can be the risks can be averted if companies are careful, but they aren't always averted. And I'll give you some examples of cases where I think there have been problems, and some of them are pretty well-known profile cases. So take Pavilion, Wyoming, where there's been so much controversy for the EPA. Pavilion, Wyoming has many, many decades of practices we don't do today, open wastewater pits. But 10 years ago, companies there were fracking to 1,000 feet or shallower in the same places where people were getting drinking water at 750 feet. Okay, that's a bad idea. it leaves you no room for error if you have any kind of problem with the structural integrity of your system. In other places, in Parker County, Texas, high-profile cases, we sometimes leave thousands of feet of unprotected wellbore with no cement. That allows pressurized gases and fluids to move up and down like a chimney. So these are things that the best companies don't do, but that some companies still do. And then finally, here in California, I like how Katharine described it. The bill's a major advance, but we still, in the Kern County, a fifth of all the oil and gas activities that we have occur directly in fresh water today. Not thousands of feet below it, but right into freshwater quality aquifers. And about a third of all of our activities in Kern County happen in USDW, this sort of 10,000 milligram threshold that Jonathan talked about. So these aren't separated by large distances. These are happening directly in these aquifers, and we need to ask, is that how we want to use our water in the state?
I have to agree with Rob that it's really hard to answer the question, is do the risk outweigh the benefits without a comparison. But I would say that in California, we're trying to build the case one way or the other. We enacted SB4 a few years ago, and right after that, coincidentally, the price of oil dropped from $100 a barrel to $40, and people stopped fracking. And there's been almost no well stimulation going on in California for the last few years, just a few here and there. So it's really hard for me to tell you, do we have the right regulations in place until we actually have some field testing to do that. I would say that that what we've seen at the few that we have seen is we haven't seen fractures that extend out into the drinking water aquifers. We haven't seen wells collapse or explode because of the pressure. In California, unlike in many places in the country, these are horizontal wells, and these are vertical wells instead of horizontal, and so the volume of fluid is much, much less when you're doing one frac in a vertical instead of miles in a horizontal. But on the other hand, you're still putting high pressure down a well and a man-made structure. Put a lot of pressure and a lot of stress on things break. So you have to be very careful, and you have to over-design, or you're going to have accidents. And accidents associated with high pressure and petroleum products are not good things to see. The other thing about California that Rob talked about is, in the east side of the Bakersfield area, the drinking water aquifer and the oil producing aquifer are exactly the same thing. There is oil and water in the same aquifer. The oil has moved there over millennium, probably migrated from the west side of the valley to the east side. So this is not a case of, all right, how do we best separate between these two activities? These two activities are happening in the same aquifer, in the same place, and have been for 100 years. We have other areas where the marine deposits, the lower down marine deposits, are very salty, and we produce a lot of salt water with that. We need to deal with that salt water. I think that's at least at this point, a much more difficult and potentially risky activity is how to deal with that salt water. The two choices are you can put it back down into the formation where it came from. Not a bad choice, but there's risk associated with getting it there and making sure that you're putting it back and you're not over pressurizing or putting it in the wrong place, that it moves. Or you can treat it on the surface and use it for something else. In California, we just went through the 5 years of extensive drought. And at the same time, we were taking large volumes of produced water and putting it back down deep underground outside of the hydraulic cycle. I'm a big proponent that we need to learn how to recycle as much as possible everywhere we can. And this is an opportunity that needs a lot of work to make sure it's safe, but I think that's the direction we need to be going.
Excellent. Thank you, Jonathan. James?
So I agree with Jonathan and Robert, but I would say yes and no. So yes, in terms of the energy independence and the economic benefits, I know in Colorado are surely felt, so kind of consider that here, but this is really kind of thinking in terms of a short time frame. We really need to think long-term carbon emissions, what are the global impacts. So yes and no. And then on the no side, this isn't a true long-term solution. It really kind of delays the implementation for sustainable energy supplies. So we kind of have to, as a society, as a world, kind of think about this positive and negative. So we have to decide at what point there is a tipping point. And then on kind of the risk, I really see Jonathan just alluded to at the end there, this idea that we need to increase our water reuse in the industry. Here, again, I think Katharine said about 100,000 gallons per well, and I'm going to now switch it over to Colorado. We use up to 20 million gallons per well. So a really big number, and this number is even going higher as our wells get longer and longer. And again, this is very different than California cap rock versus these long horizontals that just a few years ago were 1 mile. Now they're 2 miles. And now we're seeing some 3-mile horizontals. So these water volumes are increasing and going up not necessarily exponentially, but they are increasing as we see these longer wells. So really, I think on the water side here, which is the focus here, is really kind of improving the reuse. And on the water quality, and bringing this back to the risk, we do see in Colorado, we have the data to say that we see between 4 to 5% of drinking wells do get contaminated with some benzene or BTEX related compounds. And this is risk that we have accepted in Colorado and haven't had regulatory change, even though we know this does occur 4 to 5% of the time. So kind of thinking along this risk here. And then, on just management and reuse, we do see improved well construction has changed in Colorado, and there are other means that we're trying that are taking place again in Colorado, and I think in other parts of the country with newer wells, and we're seeing kind of these bad actors being these historic wells that the cement casing doesn't go as deep as it should have, or does now with the newer well casings.
Excellent. Thank you. Katharine?
Well, I will first associate myself with all of the remarks that have come so far. I think really answering risk is a difficult question, but I would just point out that here in California, fracking is predominantly for oil. I don't know how many vehicle miles are traveled in California every year, but most of California's oil is refined here and we use it to drive, and I don't think we produce enough here in California to fill everybody's tanks. So I appreciate, because fracking is associated with, I want to say, up to a quarter of the oil produced in the state, that, I get it. We haven't totally transitioned from transportation using other forms of energy. However, one point I would like to make, and we haven't really brought it up yet, is we can have really great regulations and really great law, but it comes down to implementation. Now, speaking personally, I think the Water Board's done a great job, taking the ball and running with it. But what we found out after SB4 became law was that there was some real issues with Dogger's implementation of its existing rules and regulations and the law. And some of you may remember a few years ago, there was headlines everywhere, 2,500 or more wells were improperly permitted in the wrong place. And, that was a falling down by Dogger. They don't, at that time, their records were really poor. They didn't have the kind of information that you would need to be able to answer some of these questions about risk, about what the casing was made of, do we know all the workover that happened on this well? And to be frank, the answer is no. Now, I do think that there is new leadership at Dogger, and they're running with the ball and trying to change the culture there. But that is to me, and to my mind, while it's difficult to quantify and difficult to measure, but really having the regulators really trying to get all the information possible to try and answer the questions is just incredibly important. And they're working on it. They're not there yet.
Excellent. Thank you. Damon?
I can probably give the most straightforward answer to do the risks outweigh the benefits? No. Can they be mitigated? I think, this is a water symposium. Water is life, water is precious. Here in California in a time of drought, why are we doing anything to move us, sort of do the status quo with fossil fuels instead of moving toward a clean energy future? And why take the risk? When you contaminate water, it's almost impossible, it's pretty much impossible to clean it up. And you're stuck with that for a long time, spending precious resources and money to clean up something that you could have taken steps to make sure didn't get contaminated in the first place. Some other risks are kind of inherent. There's going to be risks of the transportation of fossil fuels and the transportation of chemicals used in fracking and other operations, both in rural areas and in urban areas. And this is a water symposium talking about fracking. We're not even talking about the emissions that come out of these operations, especially in urban areas. I'm working with activists in South Los Angeles, where there are wells just a few feet from homes to try to get them some protections. What they've called for is a buffer zone to protect their homes from the impacts of oil production. So in the face of political inaction, I think we do need to try to mitigate the risks as much as possible through regulations and other approaches. But the first thing we should do is just transition away from dirty energy to clean energy.
Thank you. Thank you all. I'm going to go one more round, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. One of the questions that I gave to our panelists has to do with the practice of hydraulic fracturing elsewhere and the extent to which we can talk about models of where perhaps things are done better or done right. And basically, are there any places, to your knowledge, here in the United States or in other nations where fracking is done with what you would consider appropriate precautions and our regulatory oversight that maybe we could borrow here in California? Let's start with you, Rob.
Well, in my mind, first of all, the regulatory framework, the regulatory playing field isn't even across states. We all know that. So states have different requirements for what companies are required to disclose that's used, the chemicals used in fracturing fluids. States have differences in setbacks, how far you can be from a school or a public water supply or a home. States have different requirements in how many layers of casing. It can be one, it can be two, it can be three to protect that drinking water layer. So I think there are states where regulations are pretty good. I know of no state that has what I would consider the best regulations across all of the areas, but that's not, it's not really how we work. So I think the answer for me is in many of these states that there are companies and places where this is done properly, where I think my experience with people in the industry, they care about what they're doing. They're trying to do their job well. My experience also is that sometimes they get in a hurry. So let's talk about some of the issues. They can be in a hurry. They can have budgetary pressures placed on them by mid-level management when they need to move a drilling rig along, or when the oil price is low, or when they're trying to eke out an existence. A small company that might not be in business 40 or 50 years from now may act and drill differently than a company we know is going to be in business in 25 years or 50 years. So we have mom and pop operations along with the majors, and think what you will about big oil. I'd rather have a well drilled next to my house from a major oil company that's going to be in business in 25 or 50 years than buy a small independent that may be out of business next year. So I think it can be safely, but my experience is that when it isn't, it's primarily because people are in a hurry, people cut corners. So most of the time it's safe, occasionally it isn't, and when it isn't, good luck getting them to admit that it isn't. So, and I can say that from personal experience because we've seen I've sampled houses where the water is turned from pure to bubbling like champagne over the course of a year, and documented those changes. Those changes are real. They're not normal, but they happen.
You ask a person that has been a regulator for 34 years, and California, I think California's got the best regulations in the country, and I'd stand them up to anybody. But does that mean that they're always being followed? No. The way that regulations work is that we pass laws, and then we implement regulations. We pass regulations to implement those laws, and then we hire people to go out and make sure that they happen. But we don't hire people to go out and make sure it happens everywhere, because you guys don't want to pay that much money for us. Nobody does. So we hire people to go out and check a few percentage of what happens and extrapolate from that. And that's, in the higher the risk, the less acceptable that is. That's the way regulations work. I think we've got pretty good regulations. I think there's room for improvement in well casing and design and oversight, and making sure that we're actually getting good cement seals that go down far enough. I think that anytime you have an inherently risky activity on the surface in a rural area, you have a high potential for that shallow groundwater to be contaminated. It's a lot easier for Damon or someone like that in LA to identify a problem with a surface spill. It's really hard out in the middle of the current oil field because there's nobody around. It's a lot harder for them to stay clean. I've been out to sites that are pretty clean. I was pretty surprised. It's an oil field that's pretty clean. I've been to others that are pretty bad and pretty dirty. So is there any place that does it better than California? I don't think so. I've gone around and talked to regulators around the country as part of my job. There are some places that have what I would think are good practices that we might want to adopt about buffers that might be better than ours, but comprehensively, I think we have the best regulations in this country.
All right, thank you. James.
So yeah, I think Colorado does a pretty nice job. We do a pretty good job of collecting data. So we do sample soil and monitor wells before drilling and then after as well. The Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission collects and compiles all this data, and part of a big National Science Foundation grant we were on, part of our job was to try to mine all that data, and this is kind of a big focus for us, and that's how we were able to come up with that 4 to 5% number of contaminated wells we see, for a pretty low number in Colorado. And then in terms of monitoring, again, we have more than 50,000 wells, and I think we have 10 public health sanitarians that go out and check these 50,000 wells. So of course, just like Jonathan alluded to, you can't check every one of them, but they try to, and taking out infrared cameras to look for gas leaks, things like that. And for the oil and gas companies, their biggest fear here is, of course, getting fined for spills or a leak. So try to motivate some change there. And then I know Colorado has the highest or the most strict methane emission guidelines that I know is being adopted by other states around. So I kind of just speak to Colorado, and I think we do a pretty good job, again, of collecting the data, trying to monitor the wells, and then, of course, our new emission guideline as well.
All right, thank you. Katharine?
Well, I would agree with my fellow panelists who've talked about this issue of the buffer. It's really important that you don't have people living on top of what is effectively an industrial activity. I mean, Damon has really been at the forefront in the Los Angeles area of trying to get setbacks. And if you look in the various regulations or laws in other states, you'll see they sort of pull numbers out of the sky, 100 feet, 500 feet, 250 feet. And I think it would be really great if there was some way to really do that from a science-based perspective, to really have a defensible number. Now, what you run into is a problem of grandfathering. What do you do about the person who's got an abandoned well underneath their house in Signal Hill? They've got an abandoned well underneath their house in Signal Hill. That, how are you going to help them? I don't know the answer to that, but I think, SB4 was the beginning, as I mentioned before. What we're finding out about practices in the oil field related to fracking, it really does raise some questions about some other oil and gas field activities. And so, I would certainly hope that as we learn more from SB4, that there will be, follow-on legislation and additional regulations. And just to mention, Dogger right now, I think, has 4 regulatory packages pending. They were moving forward on fracking, and then there was the gas leak at Aliso Canyon, which Dogger was also involved in, because that was a gas storage well that was leaking because of, well, it hasn't been proven yet, so I should shut up. But I think they're trying. They're not there yet, and we are going to have to be wrestling with legacy issues here in California for a long time. Even after we decarbonize our economy, we're still going to have legacy issues to address.
All right, very good. Damon.
So it's an interesting question. Where is fracking done right? It kind of assumes facts, not an evidence, that I think fracking should be done at all. So I'm going to skip that one and move to regulatory oversight and precautions. I think I would probably agree. I'm not as familiar with Colorado's regs, but Californians probably are the best or among the best in the country. That said, it's a really low bar. So I would agree with that, but the bar was pretty low. And there are some things that California is doing well, and I think a lot of that is due to the Water Board and what SB4 has put in place. But there are giant holes, like just giant holes. And Katharine knows, we've tried to fill them, and it's like whack-a-mole, just trying to fill all these holes. You've got a public resources code, our statute here in California, that says an operator can file a notice of drilling, and if Dogger doesn't respond within 10 days, it's just deemed approved. As far as we can tell, there's no criteria or discretion that Dogger can point to and use to deny a permit. Like maybe they could, but they don't. It's not on the books, and they don't have to. And that's sort of the way they've practiced for years and years. I do agree that there's been new leadership in recent years, and then they're trying to turn the ship. But I think it's going to take a while. There are other things that you could put in place to try to mitigate against risk and have stronger regulations. For example, bonding. You could require operators to put up larger amounts of money, significant amounts of money, in the event that something catastrophic happens, or they go bankrupt and leave the state or whoever holding the bag. But that hasn't happened. There are piddly amounts of money that are required as sort of financial assurance for drilling a well or for having any sort of oil production within the state. And overshadowing all of this is the influence of the oil industry in California. California is the 3rd leading producer of oil by volume in the country, ahead of even North Dakota, I think, or ahead of Alaska, behind North Dakota, but ahead of Alaska, which is incredible if you think about the vested interest that industry has in sort of keeping the status quo of the way the agency has been facilitating oil production. And historically, that sort of revolving door of lobbyists going in to regulate the industry that they were practicing in. There's been more oversight from the legislature and efforts from watchdog groups and others to address that. And I think we're moving in the right direction. But this is going to take a long time, like Katharine says, to untangle and address a lot of this historic legacy problems we have here with the regulatory system in California.
Just to be frank with you, I was in Santa Barbara last week because there was an oil platform in state waters offshore where the oil operator, for a variety of reasons, went bankrupt, and the state's on the hook for decommissioning not only the 30-odd wells there, but the platform itself. So even if we stop producing oil 3 years from now because we don't need it anymore, still going to have the legacy issues, and I think that's going to end up a lot of that will be resolved with public money.
When I was 16, my brother told me, well, you better drive for the next couple of years because gas is going to be gone by the time that you're 20 and you're never going to be driving again. I'm now 60 and we produce more oil than we did then. I'm not optimistic that we're going to stop using oil. Even if we stop burning it for fuel, we use it in every piece of plastic that we have. It's going to be around for a long time. And so I think that we ought to concentrate on doing it as best we can and reduce as much risk as possible.
If you're worried about climate change, you should be concerned about oil production. I think it's the administration's view, Brown administration's view, that it's all about demand, demand, demand. And I can see Governor Brown making a goal or a statement that we need to get off of fossil fuel-driven cars by 2040 or whatever. And we would be completely behind that and 100%. But given the climate change catastrophe that we're in the middle of, that is urgent, 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 we have to be doing everything we can to have impacts on this complicated equation in every sector we can. And there's emerging research that shows that addressing supply and limiting production, especially the high cost, high carbon intense oil, has a climate impact. Now there's going to be some substitution in other areas of the world, and the governor is fond of saying, well, we don't want to just be importing oil from places that hate us. That's partly true, but you are going to get a climate benefit because not all of that oil is going to be produced somewhere else. It's not a perfect one-for-one substitute. So emerging research on that, and stay tuned. I still think we need to take action on the supply side in addition to the demand side.
So this is I agree, this is a tricky issue though, right? I mean, I flew here. You said you drove a couple hours here, Damon. I don't know if that was an electric car or not, but I mean, this transportation sector is the toughest sector to decarbonize, let's be frank. I mean, it's a lot easier in the electricity sector for wind and solar. We still have issues for supply and intermittency, but it's relatively simple to see in the electricity sector, but cars are hard, right? There are, 1 million electric cars or so? I mean, we have a long, long way to go. And yes, Volvo is going to stop making internal combustion engines in France, and the Scandinavian countries have said that they'll no longer allow them in China. But our oil production, our oil consumption this year is going up about 1% or 1.5% in the United States. We're using more oil per year again because gas prices are low, not less. So, I fully agree we need to get to it, but let's not be too self-righteous about this, right? This sector, the oil transportation sector, is hard.
James?
Yeah, and I don't have too much to add other than I just see this being something we're going to continue to do due to the transportation and the long transition it's going to take to get completely away from it in terms of the cost of the cars and people that have these cars. And I don't see it as a 3 to 5 year issue. I see it as a much longer term transition. So I'll just start there. I think it's mostly agreed upon that the seismic activity is generally occurring from the disposal of the wastewater. It's not actually the hydraulic fracturing. I don't say that definitively, but it's generally agreed that it's from the disposal of the wastewater. So when we start to talk about this water and reusing this water, not putting it down another hole, a disposal well, this would reduce the seismic activity. So really kind of starting at reusing this water and not just disposing of it, I think would be the number one thing to reduce the seismic activity, to making Oklahoma, I think, the most seismically active state in the country.
I would just add that I believe there was a paper a year ago or so that actually associated either fracking or the disposal of the waste fluid, I forget, with some seismic activity here in California. The issue that we have compared to other states, to my knowledge, is that we have a lot of seismic activity here anyway. So to actually pull out a signal specific to a particular injection well or a particular frac job is really hard to say. That is, though, something under SB4 that those regulations that were implemented do require a little bit of seismic monitoring, and the frac job has to stop if there is a signal received. But the larger point is just it's kind of harder to tell here in California just because we have such high background levels of seismic activity.
We know what they put in for fracturing, for well stimulation, because we have a law that requires it. We do not know what they put in for maintenance of their wells, when they're just for keeping the corrosion down in the well, for so general activities of oil production.
Routine maintenance, right?
So there's an interesting quandary here, and I totally get what you're saying, because the way the laws are set up, an oil field is an oil reserve is considered different than an aquifer, even though essentially they're interconnected in some way. Now, I'll be blunt, you don't want to be drinking the stuff that comes out of oil wells. I've seen it, you don't want to be doing that. But we don't necessarily have any authority over what happens on an oil operation, unless the legislature specifically tells us. And I appreciate that you think that we can tell the legislature what we need, but that's not really the way it works. They tell us what we should do. Anything that's a discharge of waste to waters of the U.S., waters of the state, I can make your life miserable. But when you're talking about oil production, now we're talking about oil reservoirs. Those are not the same thing as waters of the state.
Yeah.
Legally. I mean, it's all artificial. They're all aquifers. They've got different levels of, some have carbons in them, some have salt water in them, some have fresh water in them. They're all underground aquifers with different constituents in them. We don't regulate what goes into oil reserves.
Yeah, and from the oil and gas side, their side or their argument is that they have these proprietary mixtures that make their fracturing technique better than the next. So they don't want to give away their secrets. And this is the argument that is used on the oil and gas side for why. And we do have Frac Focus, which does generally list, we'll say proprietary surfactants, and you can see generally what might be used, but saying a surfactant, there's thousands and thousands of surfactants. So it's kind of a challenge. There is something, or a database, again, this is fracfocus.org, where the data is compiled, but this, again, it's this proprietary nature that is kind of the biggest hump, I think, to get over in terms of the disclosing of what the specific chemicals are in the mixture.
I would just add that specific to California, this was one of the neat things in SB4, directly due to Senator Pavley's leadership on this, that any ingredient added to a well has to be disclosed publicly. You can keep the recipe to yourself, you can call that a trade secret, but any ingredient has to be disclosed, and you got to give the chemical identification number. And all of that's publicly available. You can look on Dogger's website. It takes them a little while longer than they're supposed to get it up online, but it's there. Now, as a result of that, the oil industry has complained that we can't use the latest, greatest proprietary, because we have to disclose it. But it's like, you want to put it in the ground in California, you got to tell the regulator. The regulator can make that information publicly available. But to get back to what Jonathan said, I think there are some real issues with the specific regulations that Jonathan referred to for the underground injection control Class 2 wells, and how they address aquifers and aquifer exemptions, whether or not something is a USDW underground source of drinking water, or whether it's not. And I think particularly because in the main oil-bearing regions of the state in Kern County, that's where they've got really strong overdraft of their groundwater, the higher level sending their drinking and irrigation wells deeper and deeper. And, there's an oil field right there where somebody's disposing of their waste in there. So, which I think both Rob and Jonathan have talked about. So I think, I don't think it'll happen in our current federal administration, but it would be sure helpful, down the road while California can do what it can, should further legislation be passed. We really need to really think about having a more dynamic picture and I think a 21st century regulatory approach to the use of the aquifers, be they hydrocarbon bearing or not, in areas where we've got overdraft of the groundwater basins.
I think it's a very interesting problem because most of those people that are living in it are living in LA County. They're living over abandoned oil wells that were here. The last picture on my slide, actually to be, I think it was Huntington Beach actually. It's the ocean front with thousands of oil wells. We've been drilling oil since 1890 in California. We have thousands of abandoned oil wells and active oil wells all over. And just because you can see them in Kern County because there's no encroachment of people, there's thousands of active oil wells in LA County. You just don't see them because they've slant drilled, they've moved the piping, they've built houses around them. I think we have a serious ongoing problem of venting methane, of potential conduits of contamination that are a legacy that we're going to live with for a long time. And one of the changes in Dogger's regulations that I think is spectacular if it actually works is that an oil well that's no longer operating, it hasn't been operating for I think it's 5 years, has to be shut in, has to be closed, or they have to pay larger and larger amounts of money to keep it open. Because right now, what happens in an oil company, it's never profitable to close an oil well. You just leave it in case the price of oil gets really high and then you can pump it again. But those are degrading as they sit there. I'm not trying to disregard your comment. I don't know how we're going to deal with both the active and the inactive issues of oil production all over the state. It is unbelievable.
Rob?
Great, fantastic question. So here's a couple of things, a couple of thoughts. Here's one area where California is not the best. California has wells that sit idle for decades. Most states do not allow you to do that. Right? You can't just get another 5 and 10 and 15-year extension on an idle well. California, we are not at the top of the list in that respect. We let these wells sort of sit there in a literally and figuratively an idle state. Your point about people in color and proximity, I think this is a water panel, but we also need to think about air quality. Because the people, especially in the Central Valley, living around these facilities, in LA too, the issues in LA are different, but the materials, the chemicals that waft downwind from operations when they leak, those matter too. We published a study last year where we flew about 8,000 random well pads across the country. So imagine a restaurant inspection where you can show up in a helicopter unannounced, but you have an infrared camera and you can hover over a well pad and film it and figure out who's leaking and where those chemicals are going. So we did that and found that depending on where we were in the country, anywhere from 1 in 100 to 1 in 7 wells had detectable emissions that were drifting downwind. So I think we need to be thinking about the water, but we also have to think about the air emissions and the people who are living nearby, the schools that are nearby, and all that, and the Bakersfield area and the Central Valley is sort of central to that issue.
So I just want to emphasize another issue with these abandoned wells and idle wells that are sort of littered throughout Southern California and other places is those are active conduits to potential groundwater. I mean, if the casing broke, if it was drilled and constructed in a shoddy way, that is just ripe to be a pathway for contamination to get into our aquifers. So as you know, on a water panel, we definitely need to be thinking about that legacy problem we're going to be dealing with. But to your specific question, absolutely, thank you for raising it. I think we did a report a few years ago that sort of laid out and mapped where some of these communities are, and it's staggering the percentage of folks who are in low-income communities of color. Just a little bit more about our work in South LA with the Stand LA Coalition, Stand Together Against Neighborhood Drilling. They're seeking a 2,500-foot health and safety buffer in the city of Los Angeles. And actually just yesterday, 2 days ago? I can't remember. The City of LA Health Commission, which is an advisory body to the City Council of Los Angeles, unanimously approved a recommendation to advise the City Council to impose this buffer. But it took hundreds of activists and groups going down to City Hall and sharing their stories about what these impacts are having on communities. And I know this is a water panel, but the air pollution, as Rob said, is something that people are dealing with on a daily basis. So baby steps. I mean, the City Council would still have to bring it forward and take a very difficult vote. I think it's an uphill climb, but we're making progress as we move forward.
Katharine, James, last words?
I would just say that this is not at the state level, but I believe Los Angeles City filled their local oil and gas administrator position in the last year or so, which had been vacant for a long time. So I think at the local level, that will be really helpful. Zoning is not done at the state level. That's usually done at the local level. But I think the environmental justice issues associated with oil and gas development, because LA is built on a bunch of oil fields, are just enormous. And I do think that's where we'll be able to get action is because of those issues. That's my personal opinion.
Yeah, and on the research side, just try to continue to identify some maybe unique chemicals that might be there that are unique to hydraulic fracturing or different stimulation techniques, that if there was an event that you could theoretically identify what it was and where it's coming from. And then I'll just kind of use an analogy for Colorado that I think would be very relevant here is we have a lot of old wells that we're currently pumping, but very, very slowly, and now people are buying up these wells because they've found it to be more economical as they've kind of brought the price per barrel down of what it takes to produce, and we're actually seeing more development around communities because communities have spread out in Colorado, and now all of a sudden you have this new development and you had just a single well near this development. Well, that now has been bought up and now it's 30 or 40 wells are being developed on that pad. So maybe if the price of oil goes up, this might be something that might be experienced here, and kind of targeting what to, if it's water or air quality, which I think is a very important factor here. So kind of thinking maybe further down the line, if that starts to change, if oil starts to go up, what are the impacts here in these communities?
Can I just add?
Go ahead.
So I know we've been talking about LA and we've been talking about Colorado and some of these other places. We're here in Irvine, and Orange County has oil wells. I mean, there are wells right here where I'm from Orange County, I'm from La Palma, so I grew up going to Huntington Beach. I was at a hearing at Huntington Beach City Hall, and there's an oil well drilling in the parking lot. I mean, there are folks in Brea who were concerned about some drilling that was happening right, I think next to the high school or one of the schools there. There were hearings that happened before that city council. So don't think that because you're down here in the burbs that you're not being affected by this. There are wells all throughout Orange County as well.
Please give it up for all of our panelists, Jonathan, Rob, Katharine, Damon, and James.